Masechta Chala, Per Gimel Mishnah Aleph. Oichlin aray min isa asher tisgalgal bechitim v'setamtim b'sa'orim. We may eat casually aray just like we had by Maisus. You can't eat achilas keva from the dough. Asher tisgalgal bechitim until it's completely kneaded. In the case of dough that's made out of wheat, v'setamtim b'sa'orim, or until it's packed together. In the case of barley, what are we talking about over here? What's the Mishnah discussing? So there's two stages in making the dough in regard to the chiyuv of challah. The first stage is reached when the flour is mixed with water, as we'll see in this Mishnah. And before this, there's no chiyuv to separate challah, and you can eat the grain without any problem. Once this stage is reached, once you get to this point that you mix it together, then by separating challah, you could do that, even though there's still no chiyuv to separate challah. So what are we holding? The flour and the water is mixed together. You can separate challah, even though the chiyuv is not yet. In addition, after it reached the first stage, midrabanan, it may be eaten only achilas aray. The dough may be eaten in that manner until the gemar malacha has been reached. The exact point will be defined in the Mishnah. Once the gemar malacha is reached, the chiyuv to separate challah takes effect, and the dough is considered tevel, which may not be eaten in any manner at all, just like we had by truma. So the Mishnah will define when dough that has reached the first stage is considered to have reached the gemar malacha, and which is the second stage. So oichlin aray min isa, we may eat casually from a dough asher tisgalgal bechitim until it's completely kneaded. If the dough is made out of wheat, it's a tamtim b'sa'orim, or until it's packed together. In the case of barley, what's the difference of lashonis? So when you make a dough out of chitim, it mixes together very well. So the Rav says asher tisgalgal shetis arav yaf, it's mixed together well. It's a tamtim b'sa'orim, because the dough of sa'orim falls apart, it's very crummy. Ve'ena misareves yafek isa shel chitim, it doesn't mix together nicely like the dough made out of wheat. Elamatamtim biyad, you got to squish it together. You have to pack it down firmly by hand, and you leave it as it is. It's rather very interesting. I just want to mention here, there's a Sefer Piskei Tshuva. It's a Likut Tshuvas. It was written probably close to 100 years ago, and it's a Likut of interesting Tshuvas. And on the bottom he has Ha'aris, and he explains different Zachem. So I believe it's Siman Yud or Siman Yud Aleph. He brings there from the Maram Shik b'shem his Rebbe Duchsam Sefer that eating barley is kashal shikha. So I was trying to figure out what exactly, it's not mentioned in the Gemara anywhere. So why is barley? I mean, barley we know is ma'achal behema, but more than just the mere fact of it being ma'achal behema, I think he's talking over there that you shouldn't make matzah out of barley because it's ma'achal behema, it's pasnish. So, however, whatever it is, but barley is very crummy, it just doesn't hold together. Just another interesting chiddush about barley. I don't know la halacha what this is about, but al kapanim as I state. Gilgula bechita v'timtam b'sa'orim. However, once the woman or whoever is making the dough completed kneading in the case of the wheat dough, or packed it together in the case of the barley dough, ha'oichel mimena chayav misa. One who eats from it without first separating challah is chayav misa b'dei shamayim. Once the wheat dough is completely kneaded, or the barley dough was nistamtem, it's finished and it has the gemar malacha already. And it's mechuyev and challah. Someone who eats the dough that already had gemar malacha without separating challah, it's tevel, and he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. As soon as she puts the water into the challah, into the bowl that she's going to knead the dough in, magbez chalasa, she can separate the challah even though the flour did not yet mix with the water. As long as there aren't 5 revam of dry flour, which is the minimum amount that's mechuyev and challah remaining there in the bowl that she's kneading it in. So if the amount of flour is not yet mixed with water, the challah separation will be effective not only for the flour that has already been mixed with water, but also for any unmixed flour in the bowl. Okay, Mishnah Beis. Nidma yisasa achla gilgula. If the dough became meduma, the produce of truma became mixed into it before she completed kneading it, before the dough was mechuyev and challah p'tura, then even after she completes kneading it, it remains pater from challah. Meduma pater, because meduma is pater from challah. Why? So this kula is based on the fact that challah bezmana says only midrabanan. So the chachamim were masakin this chiyuv of challah said that in the case of meduma there's no chiyuv. So being that it's only midrabanan anyway, so if it's meduma, it's not a problem. Umisha gilgala chayaves. But if her dough became meduma after she completed kneading it, which is after it was mechuyev and challah, after the gemar malacha, chayaves, she's mechuyev and challah even though it's meduma now. Since it already was mechuyev and challah originally, so it remains with the chiyuv of challah. So we spoke before that we mentioned in the previous parak that it's asur to cause challah to become tameh. This is learned out from a pasuk of that the pasuk compares it to truma, and causing dough to become tamei even before it's mechuyev and challah is asur as well, but for a different reason. If the dough is tamei, the challah that will be separated from it will also become tamei. This will cause a hefsed to the kohen who will receive the challah because he's not allowed to eat it. The Mishnah now discusses a case if you have a suffix tumah. If there's a doubt that perhaps the dough became tamei, it depends. So actually, Gilgala, if the suffix came about before she completed kneading the dough, before it was mechuyev and challah, tasa b'tumah, then it may be prepared. The kneading may be completed in tumah, in a way that it will be vaday tamei. Umisha Gilgala, but if the suffix came up only after she completed kneading the dough, it was already mechuyev and challah, tasa b'tara. It must be prepared. It must be completed b'tara. She must continue to make sure that it doesn't have any contact with tumah. Although the dough is already possibly tamei, it's also to make it vaday tamei once it becomes mechuyev and challah. This is also based on the pasuk, just like we have by truma. The chulin hatvulum lechallah kechallah damu. The chulin that's tevel together with the challah is like challah. Truma tluya tzricha shimur, and there's a din that truma tluya, a suffix of truma, has to be protected in order that it shouldn't become tamei. I mean, it shouldn't become tamei vaday. Okay, Mishnah Gimel. Hekdisha isas actually Gilgala. Produce that belongs to hektish is not mechuyev and challah because it doesn't belong to you. So the Mishnah explains that this halacha depends on what stage of the process of the dough it was when he was makdish it. So hekdisha isas actually Gilgala, if she was makdish her dough to the Beis Hamikdash before she completed kneading it, before the chiyuv of challah, ufdasa, and then she redeemed it right away before completing the kneading. Chayaves, she's mechuyev and challah. Even though the dough that's hektish is patur from challah, this dough was no longer hektish when the kneading was completed, so it's going to be mechuyev and challah. Misha Gilgala. So too, if she was makdish the dough after she completed kneading it, in which case it has already become mechuyev and challah ufdasa, and then she was paided afterwards. So chayaves, she's mechuyev and challah. Once a dough becomes mechuyev and challah, it remains mechuyev even if you were makdish it later. Although the Mishnah speaks of a case where he was paid already, the hektish produce remains mechuyev and even if it wasn't redeemed, since the chiyuv took place before they were makdish it. Hikdishasa achli gilgala. However, if she was makdish it before she needed it, before there was a chiyuv of chalav, a gilgala hagizbar, and the treasurer of hektish completed the gilgul, he made the rest of the dough. And then she redeemed it. It's part from challah because the b'shas the chiyuv of challah. B'shas there was chal, the chiyuv of challah, so it was pater since it belonged to hektish. Since the dough is pater from challah when the kneading was completed, it remains pater even after the pidyon. And the gilgul of hektish is pater the chsiv arisei seichem le'is says hektish arisei seichem has to belong to you, and if it doesn't belong to you, then you're not mechuyev in challah. Mishnah Dalet. Kayotza, similarly we find that a hamakdish peirosav shlebol ones hamaisus, if someone was makdish his fruits before they reach the chiyuv of maisus, which we discussed previously in Masechta Maisus, that there's a concept called onas hamaisus. That's when usually referring to a different time of the growing produce reaches the point where it becomes edible. The Mishnah here is referring to the completion of the processing, which is generally referred to as gemar melocha. So if someone was makdish his fruits before they reached the time of maisus ufadon, and then he redeemed them while they didn't yet reach the time of maisus, they're mechuyev in maisus. So too, if he was makdish them after they already reached the time of maisus and then redeemed them, they're mechuyev in maisus, because here too the produce wasn't hektish when the gemar malacha happened. So it became mechuyev in maiser. It became mechuyev in maiser already. So the chiv remains in effect even if the produce was then hukdash and he was paid. If, however, he was makdish them before the processing was complete, and the gizbar, and it was in the hands of the gizbar when they were ripe, when they were mechuyev in maiser, and then the owner redeemed them, they're pater from maiser. Because at the time of their chiyuv, at the time of the chiyuv maiser, they were kadosh and pater from maiser, even though he was paid to them. Even though he was paid to them afterwards, they still remain pater from maiser, because the pasuk says the gon chav aloy dagon hektish, the dogon that belongs to you, and not the dogon that belongs to hektish. If the dogon belongs to hektish, so then it's not going to be mechuyev in Ma'aser. That's the common theme that we have, that when the pasuk says Arisei Seichem, or the Gonacha is possessive to you, so then if the Hektish is holding it, so then you're not holding it, so then it's not going to be mechuyev in Ma'aser, it's not going to be mechuyev in Chala. Weiter sagt der Mishnah Hey. If a guy gave flour to a yid to make dough for the yid is a baker, so the guy brings him the ingredients that he needs to make a dough. So pturim and achala, the dough is patur from chala because it belongs to the guy. The pasuk says arisei seichem, your dough, which that's where you have a chiv of chala. And the Gemara Menachos on Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph teaches that this pasuk of arisei seichem is teaching me that a guy's flour, a guy's dough is patur min achala. Nasan le matana. If the guy gave the dough as a matana to the yid who's preparing the dough, so actually gilgus, it depends. If the guy gave the dough to the yid before the yid completed kneading the dough, chayiv. So the yid is mechuyev to separate challah when he completes the dough, because the dough is owned by a yid when the chiyav of challah takes effect. Misha gilgal, however, if the guy gave the dough to a yid after he completed kneading the dough, then he's part from challah because it belonged to the guy at the time when the chiyav of challah took place. Now, what if a yid makes a dough together with the guy, and each owns part of the dough, but they're making it in the bowl together? The halacha is that if the portion owned by the yid doesn't contain the minimum shear that's mechuyev in challah, if the yid owns less than chameshes ram kemach of this dough, the dough is patur from challah. Although the entire dough contains chameshes ram kemach, the chelik of the dough that's owned by the guy is not counted towards the minimum shear, because the part that's owned by a guy doesn't contain the minimum shear of challah, because there's no chiyuv of challah whatsoever. The Mishnah implies that if the yid owns 5 revam of the flour, the dough is mechuyev in challah. The fact that a guy owns part of it is not enough to pater the yid from taking off challah from here. You have to take a look in Pesachim on the Avav, where the Gemara discusses a similar case about taking taxes off doughs. Okay. Mishnah Vav. Gershon is Gayer. If somebody converted to Yiddishkeit, he became a Ger of Hoysle Isa, and he owned the dough. Nasas Achlein is Gayer if it was completed before he was Megayer, meaning whether it was Nizgalgal Bechitim or Nitamtem B'Sa'orim, then he's parted from separating challah from it because it belonged to a guy when the chiyuv of challah took place. Umishan is gayer. However, if the dough was completed after he was megayer, sechayiv is mechuyev in challah. V'im safek, if he's not sure when the dough was made before he was megayer or not, sechayiv he's mechuyev to separate challah from it. Since there's a safek whether the dough is mechuyev in challah, it's safek lechumra, and we separate challah. The challah that's separated is going to be a safek. It's not going to be vadai challah, since the dough may have been owned by a yid when the chiyuv of challah took effect. So the portion separated as challah may be actual challah that may not be eaten by anyone who's not a kohen. On the other hand, since it may have been owned by a guy at that time, it may not be challah. Therefore, the halacha would be amaytzi mechaver levaraya, and the kohen has no legal claim to the challah since he can't prove that he has any rights to it. Nevertheless, since only a kohen can eat it, the owner has no choice other than to give it to a kohen to eat. However, the owner may charge the kohen money for it because it's not matnas kuna, because it's a problematic kind of dough. However, if a non-kohen eats a shalaikadin that was separated, meaning that this piece of challah that was separated mini safek, so they're not mechuyev to add a chaimish if they ate it. Normally, a non-kohen who eats challah b'shegeg, besides for paying back the keren, he also needs to add a chaimish, which is a fifth of the total amount that he's paying. In the case of a safek, however, the zor is not mechuyev to pay the extra chaimish. Rabbi Kiva Omer kol holech acher hakrima betanur. The Rabbi Kiva says that it's entirely dependent on the time when the crust forms in the oven. That's whether the ger is mechuyev to separate challah from the dough. It does not depend on whether he was a yid at the time when he needed the dough. Like we were talking this whole parak so far, that it's totally in the Gilgul Ha'isa, but rather it goes after the krima betanur. It goes after when the dough became crusted in the oven. So what's this? What's the pshat in this? According to Rabbi Kiva, the dough becomes mechuyev in challah when a crust forms on the bread, not when the dough is completed. And not only that, but this is what Rabbi Kiva holds in all the Mishnayos. The Savar Rabbi Kiva, I'm going to read the Rav. The Savar Rabbi Kiva ein gemar malachta shal chalat sheyikru mupnei hapas betanur. that the gemar malacha of challah is not until the dough starts getting crusted in the oven. V'zuhi aynasa l'challah, and this is the time when you're mechuyev in challah. Hilkachim is gayer kaidem sheyikrim rupnei pas b'tanon chayav b'challah. Therefore, if he was megayer before the crust started, before the crust started getting into the challah, so then he's going to be mechuyev in challah. And this is what Rabbi Akiva is going to hold in all 5 mishnayos, and really all previous 5 mishnayos until now. Rabbi Akiva holds that the halachas of all the mishnayos will depend on when the dough develops a crust, rather than on when the dough is completely kneaded. Okay, Mishnah Zayin. We learned in Parak Aleph Mishnah Aleph that the chiyuv of challah applies only to dough that's made from the chameshes minei dagon, which is chitim, se'orim, shiboy l'shual, shifain, and make sure you get all of them: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Kusmin, shiboy l'shual, yeah. So if a person made dough from a mixture of wheat and rice flour, so it's a mix. It's, let's say, half and half. So dough made from any other grain, such as rice, as pater from challah, may not be used for the chiyuv of matzah. So im yesh bar tam dogon, if the flavor of the wheat grain can be tasted in the dough, chayav b'challah. Similarly, a person can fulfill his chiyuv of eating matzah on Pesach made from this dough. But if the flavor of the wheat cannot be tasted in the dough, it's not going to be mechuyev challah. But and a person cannot fulfill his chiyuv of eating matzah on Pesach with the matzah made from it. If the wheat flour can be tasted in the dough, one must separate challah from it, even if you have a roiv of oirez, even if you have a roiv of rice in the dough than the wheat flour. In fact, challah must be separated even if the amount of wheat flour on its own is less than chameshes revam, the minimum amount of flour needed to create the chiyuv of challah. As long as the wheat flour and the rice flour together add up to chameshes revam, and the flavor of wheat can be tasted in the dough is mechuyev challah. Generally, the halacha is that when you have a taruvis by the part that makes up its majority, in a case such as ours, however, so a lot of times things are batal b'roiv, but in our case we were talking about tam ke'ikr, and gives consideration even to something that makes up a small part of the mixture if its flavor can be detected. So our Mishnah is teaching us that if the flavor of wheat can be tasted in the dough, the entire dough is regarded as if it was made out of wheat. Fine. Mishnah Ches. If someone takes a piece of sourdough from a dough whose challah has not yet been separated, and by mistake he puts a sourdough into a dough whose challah has already been separated, so he created a mixture of dough of chulin, the dough from which challah has already been separated, and a dough of tevel. So what should he do? Sourdough is made by leaving dough to ferment. It's added to regular dough in order to make it rise. It's very popular today with the sourdough breads. So our Mishnah is discussing a person who placed a small piece of sourdough into a dough from which the challah had been separated already, now realizing the challah had not yet been separated from the sourdough. The Mishnah discusses a common case. The same halach would apply to a case where dough and even not se'or, that was tevel, was mixed into dough which challah has already been separated. So what do? So you do as follows. If he has a batch of flour to bring from somewhere else, which together with the sourdough contains a minimum of chaveshes revam kamach, which would now be mechuyev and challah, so he'll add that flour into the dough, and he'll join the two batches of dough together. The new dough is placed so that it touches the dough and the sourdough mixture, connecting the two batches. So the two batches are combined, they contain the minimum of chameshes revam kamach. The new batch of dough on its own, however, contains less than chameshes revam kamach. Okay, so umayti lefi cheshbon, v'imlav mayti chala achas halakol. So let's take it slow. The reason why the new batch of dough must contain less than chameshes revam kamach is as follows. We explained earlier that min haTorah the sourdough should be bottled. It's mechuyev and challah only midrabanan. Therefore, we'll explain like this: when challah is separated from the se'or, it may be separated only from the dough. That's also mechuyev and challah only midrabanan. Had the new dough contained chameshes revam on its own, it would have been mechuyev midiraisa. Therefore, we take a dough that contains less than the shear, less than the chiyuv, which is not going to be mechuyev in challah at all. So the new dough is joined with the original dough it will be mechuyev and challah only because it's mixed together with the original dough. Since the original dough is mechuyev only midrabanan, since the sourdough is going to be batel not Torah, so the chiyuv of the new dough is also midrabanan. So basically, you want to make a tziruf over here to make sure that it's only going to be derabanan. And then what do? You're mighty lefi cheshbon. Then he separates an amount of challah from the new dough in proportion to the amount of tevel in both doughs together. So what's the cheshbon here? He calculates the total amount of tevel in the two doughs, and he separates 1/24 of that amount, or 48th if the dough is being baked for a sale. Since the challah being separated only for the tevel, not for the entire dough, it's sufficient to separate an amount of 1/24 to the tevel. So if only 1/3 of the dough is tevel, he needs to declare 1/24 of that third of the entire dough of challah. So he's not taking off challah from the entire dough, he's taking off challah only from this part, only in this third, let's say. But if he doesn't have another batch of flour from which to make a new dough, he must separate one full measure of challah, 1/24 from within the dough, and sourdough mixture for the entire mixture of dough and sourdough. Mishnah Tes. Similarly, nikuf. What are we talking about over here? So just like we discussed halacha of challah, that applies to a dough, that part of it has tevel in it, the Mishnah is going to discuss a similar situation with a case of trumas and ma'asos. As the halacha is that halachas of trumas and ma'asos do not apply to the matnas aniyim. The Mishnah discusses a case where the matnas aniyim got mixed in together with ma'asos. So kayotza by zeisei masik shen sarvim zeisei nikuf. With regard to harvested olives, which are tevel, that got mixed with picked olives, that he wants to leave over for the aniyim, and they're not going to be mechuyev ma'aser because that's what he's leaving for the aniyim. So invei butchim, invei oilos, or he harvested grapes that are tevel that got mixed in with oilos, grapes that are left as matnas aniyim, so not mechuyev ma'asers. So he can do as follows in order to be mated a mixture. If he has a batch of tevel of the same type of produce that he can bring from somewhere else, he may separate an amount of ma'aser from that batch of tevel in proportion to the amount of tevel in the mixture. But if he does not have another batch of tevel from which to separate trumas or ma'aser from the tevel in the mixture, he must separate the amount of truma and trumas ma'aser necessary for the entire mixture and give those portions to the kohen. First he separates truma g'dayla, then he separates 1/10 as ma'aser rishon, and which must be separated before ma'aser sheni, before trumas ma'aser. Afterwards he separates 1/10 of ma'aser rishon as trumas ma'aser, gives the truma g'dayla and trumas ma'aser to a kohen. And for the remaining ma'aser rishon and ma'aser sheni or ma'aser onim when applicable, the amount of fruits he treats as ma'aser is in proportion to the amount of tevel in the olives or the grapes mixture. As with truma, he must designate an amount of ma'aser that's sufficient for the entire mixture. Nevertheless, unlike truma, he's not mechuyev to give all the fruits he designated as ma'aser rishon to a levi or give the entire ma'aser onim to the poor, nor is he mechuyev to be paida the entire ma'aser sheni. Rather, he gives or is paida only the amount of ma'aser that corresponds to the amount of tevel in the mixture. So you're not doing it for the whole mixture; you're doing it just for the amount of tevel that got mixed into the taruvas. So you got basically what you're doing is you're being mafresh connected the amount of the tevel that fell in. Say in the case of Mishnah Tes and say in the case of the challah Mishnah Ches. So you're not doing it for the whole thing; you're doing it just for that little bit of tevel that fell in. Okay. Mishnah Yud, Hanoitel Seor Me'isas Chitim. If someone takes a piece of sourdough from a wheat dough of tevel, and places it into a rice dough which is not mechuyev and challah. Im yesh bo tam dogon, if you can taste the wheat in the dough, chayav b'challah, because we said the halacha is tam ke'ikr. Vim lav, but if it doesn't give it a flavor, you can't taste it. P'tura, it's potter. The sourdough is bottled in the rive of chulin rice dough, and there's no chiyuv at all to separate challah. Im kain, if it's so that the tevel sourdough asus the rice dough, only if the flavor of the sourdough can be tasted. Lama amru tevel eis b'chol shehu. So regarding what case that the Chachamim say that tevel asers even the smallest amount, which is a general rule that tevel should aser b'chol shehu, but we're seeing over here that tevel doesn't, right? Because we said before in Mishnah Ches she'en le parnasa she'mevi ala kol, right? So now what's the pshat in this? So min b'minay. This that we say that tevel is bottle that tevel asers b'chol shehu is regarding a mixture of food of one kind within its own kind, like the case of Mishnah Ches. Both the sourdough and the dough are made out of wheat. In that case, the mixture is asur even if the tevel cannot be tasted. But regarding a mixture of food of one kind with a different kind of food, such as our Mishnah, where he has oiras mixed together with chitim, so then that's going to be nice and tam. The halacha is that tevel asurs only when it gives a nice and tam. The Gemara by the Zara and the Ein Gimel Amud Beis explains, Mina Torah, even a single kernel of grain may be separated as truma, no matter how much grain there is in the pile. The chiyuv to separate a 50th is only etakon d'Rabbanan. Therefore, the Chachamim were goyzer that just as a single kernel of grain may be separated as truma, so too a single kernel of tevel is significant enough to make an entire pile of chulin forbidden. This applies, however, only if the tevel and the chulin are min b'minai, since one species cannot be designated as truma for a different min. So tevel of different species does not prohibit the mixture. Adkan, paragimel of challah.